Welcome to the People's Basics. Today is June 9th, and today on the program, we are doing another Commoner's Corner. But before we get into today's interview with one of the members of our community, we want to remind you all to please subscribe to the channel below. That way you are always notified for our movement for the universal basics of income, services, and rights. As well, please check the description section down below for our Linktree link, which will give you all of our links to connect with our community, as well as to be able to sign up for an interview yourself and come on to the program. Today, we're going to be talking to Cullen, and we are looking forward to having our conversation about a variety of topics within kind of a more lefty populist movement. But without further ado, I want to bring Calvin onto the program to introduce himself and get into today's conversation. Calvin,
well, hey.
Welcome to the People's Basics.
Well, hey, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to have a convo with you.
Yeah, Calvin, glad to be able to have you on. It's always great to talk to members of the community. But for those who don't know you well, could you introduce yourself to fellow people at the People's Basics? Could you let them know, where you're from, what you do, and how you politically identify?
Absolutely. So I would say, first off, my name's Calvin. I'm born and raised in Birmingham area of Alabama. Recently moved just at the beginning of this year to South Carolina. And so I've operated a lot, of course, in that southern, deep conservative states. And so that's something that having my political beliefs, which is more left populist, and if I had to label myself, I would put myself as just left populist. I think that my main focus is economics. I do, my kind of stated main goal politically is we need to transform our economy and our government to work more for the middle class and low income Americans instead of those at the top of our economy. And so we've had that type of politics for about 40 years, 50 years now, of where the top is really given the most influence in our politics. And that has led to a lot of destruction and I would say economic and, even, social distress with a lot of middle class and low income folks. And I think that the way that we change a lot of that is starting to, like I said, transform the way we operate and to be more focused on common people and Main Street instead of Wall Street.
I mean, I resonate obviously with a lot of that. The big focuses here at the People's Basics are economic issues like universal basic income and universal basic services, as well as democracy reform. But I want to hear more in your opinion, Calvin, talking through some of that like economic transformation that's been happening for the past several decades that has led to this point of mass inequality and some of the, domination by the top of the economic spectrum. Can you talk to me about what you think needs to change? Like, why do you think that problem started to arise?
Well, I think it started to arise. I hate to sound like someone that wants to, I would say be divisive, but there was definitely an effort by, I would say it started firstly, I'm a student of history, so it goes back. It starts with, the Carter administration came in and brought in a lot of people who were, neoliberal, and that was focused on, trying to essentially make products as cheap as we can, while also trying to make them, still profitable. And the way to do that was to send jobs out of America, because we had a lot of standards and we had a lot of rules and regulations that required companies to act in a certain way. Carter dropped some regulations that actually were beneficial. I think he dropped some regulations that helped to lead to gas prices being cheaper at the time. That was important for Americans, and he also helped agriculture out a lot. Being a peanut farmer, of course, is something that he wanted to take care of. But there was also this beginning of a wave of deregulation of Wall Street and deregulation of corporations that led to, of course, the Reagan era, where, it's just like, hey, open the barn door and let them loose. And so since then, we've been, in a situation where simply put, I mean, those who are essentially in financialization and in, private equity, all of that kind of area of our economy has become the main, focus for our economic agenda instead of production, which is what America used to be about. We used to be about like actually making products instead of just moving money around, right? And
Yeah,
like,
we've really had a shift to that service-based economy compared to manufacturing. But I really love that you're actually starting the point with Carter. I think a lot of people just skip right to Reagan, but it was really during those last few years while Carter was in power when they were actually trying to address stagflation that they were like, okay, we have to embrace the globalized economy. We got to deregulate, and it really did start at that point. So let me ask you, flashing forward, there's been a lot of these damages that have been done through Carter, Reagan, and all the subsequent administrations since. What do you think are some of those changes that are needed now?
I think now when it comes to changes, I'm a big supporter of Andrew Yang. Of course, I am a supporter of most universal programs, especially when it comes to universal basic income. I believe that I live the reality that like an extra $1,000 a month goes a long way for me, and I know that there are many people in this country that would be benefited by that. I also feel that Wall Street reform is major. I mean, we've got to reinstate Glass-Steagall. We've got to reinstate various laws that protect the consumers, and this is my biggest thing. A lot of people feel that I'm too heavy on the idea of government intervening in the economy. But this is my main thing. I'm all for the idea of a market-based economy, but we have to ensure that there are regulations and rules to protect workers and consumers. I think that those have to be protected just as much as the interests of the corporations themselves. And so when it comes to, and even when it comes to in a global economy, we are in a situation where it goes back to how we make products as cheap as we can. Well, the obvious answer for them is to just go to countries where they can exploit labor. And so in my mind, I think we should involve government in that so that our nation can be seen as better on the global stage and saying, well, we're going to set standards that our companies also have to deal abroad a certain way with their employees and with their the citizens of that country, because that could be something that has to do with our trade and with our diplomacy with the country. But all of it goes back to just middle class and low income policies that are mostly universal. I think that healthcare and costs such as child care and various things that make life harder for, or I would say it definitely makes life harder, but particularly it makes it more expensive for people. We need to be able to just lift some of those expenses completely off the table for them and put a system in place that I would say is focused more on improving the lives of everyone. Because I think that for some reason, because of that era of politics we discussed at the beginning in the 80s and 70s and 90s, there was this idea of like, let's break down society and focus on the individual. Let's break down community and focus on the individual. And I'm not saying that individual happiness and individual success isn't important, but there has to be some bigger goal or some basic understandings, right, of what society should be, what the community should provide for its citizens. And I think that we broke that down to a place where we believe it's like there are people that I talk with almost at least I think once a week, or at least I would say once every week or other week, I have an argument about healthcare with someone. And my whole mindset on it is or healthcare or student loans, these are two examples. If there is a way that I can better life for another American where they don't have to go through the challenges that I went through, then that's good to me. But there are some people with that mindset like, oh, well, I had to go through this issue. Like it's the meme of the train car, right? Where it's the people, you can stop this train at any time. But what about the people that thought it's already been ran over by the train? And they're saying, well, we should just not save the people that are tied to the track already because there are people in the past that have been killed by the train. What does that make? What sense does that make? Right. And that goes back to how there was a breakdown, a purposeful, I think, breakdown by government and by a lot of institutions of communities into saying, no, it's the individual that's more important than the community, which I don't know if that's really the best approach to our society.
Yeah, there's several interesting themes there that I would love to touch on. So the first is this general notion of building up the bottom, which we obviously agree on here. It's very important to make sure that you have these universal programs as well, so that people aren't falling through the supposed bottom, so that it's actually capturing everyone and we can universally lift people up. The second thing is that I like that you have the focus of the big picture top. What is actually controlling all of these different groups? Well, if it's the profit motive, originally it's going to be the need for money. And how do a lot of these businesses get their access to money? You have to go through Wall Street, who is the main access to being able to provide loans. And a lot of the times that can come with strings attached. And even Wall Street itself is dictating not just like, oh, what is it going to take for you to get our money, but where should we even be focusing the money? As well as the practice of taking on in a capitalist system, you're supposed to have the reward of being able to get profit, but you need to be able to be willing to accept the risk of loss so that you don't do reckless behaviors. And right now, so much of the system is to say, hey, if you do these reckless things that you are doing for more profit, don't worry, we'll just bail you out if that comes. So they don't have a lot of this downside risk to actually bake in. So I think that's important, that we got to focus on properly regulating the top to make sure that it's not abusing downstream, because you have more power and therefore you can make more of an exertion. It's similar to how we do our law enforcement system today, in that certain people prey upon the vulnerable, and you say we have this arbiter to step in and say, hey, you're not allowed to be infringing upon their rights in that manner. Likewise, we need that same thing for corporations, and we have certain things like the CFPB that started to do that process, but we need even more of that. And then I think the last thing that I thought you said that was interesting is this cultural dynamic that has shifted. And I do agree with you. Largely, we've moved away from this communal purpose. Like even a lot of like the 60s and 70s was when he had this big like Cold War era. We were thinking so much about like this collective unity about how do we stand up against this great force. We set big missions of how do we get to the moon. And then you're right. There's this kind of cultural era that I think was more Reagan than Carter, where we started to focus on the welfare queens and individual decisions and abortion as a fault of the mother who is reckless and they shouldn't have that right. We focused so much on individuality that we destroyed this notion of collective solidarity. And I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, let's put to the side the policies for a moment, but culturally, how do you think we can even reinforce that notion of community when things feel so polarized currently?
I'll say this, even though you may want to put them to the side, I think that it goes back to policy still, because I think that
Sure.
I think it goes back to the fact of the matter is, one of the biggest things, man, is that I tweeted this, I think today or yesterday, but it was essentially there are a lot of people that are skeptical of our government and our institutions. And I'm not saying that everyone who is skeptical of the government or of our institutions or public institutions or even private institutions as well, I'm not saying that every skeptic of those institutions are correct, but there's certainly a reason for every American to be skeptical of our government and of those institutions, right? And so we have to understand that. I think for me, there has to be an understanding that like so many of our cultural issues are used to divide middle class and low income Americans. So there is no solidarity. So there is no coming together to understand that people are getting screwed royally by our government and our institutions, economically in particular, right? And we may get advancements in cultural issues. And I'm not saying that those are not, great moments of progress. But to me, when JP Morgan Chase posts something like I'm bisexual, when JP Morgan Chase posts something about LGBT, right? And I know that they're also probably still giving predatory loans out to LGBT folks. then it makes no. I don't really. Your like
Yeah,
what is
we
the
hate the
point of this,
tokenism.
right? Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like I'm not a fan of it, and like I'm very critical of the Obama administration. I'm very critical of um, the way he operated. I'm very critical of the way he responded to the 2008 financial crisis.
yeah.
I feel that Barack Obama, and I think like race is something that a lot of people will try to use. Just because Barack Obama was an African American does not mean me as an African American feels truly represented by him, right? And I'm someone that looks at policy above identity, above personality. And another example is like with Andrew Yang. I like him. I think he may be a pretty cool dude. I've never met him, so I can't really give a solid, um, you know, concrete answer on that because I never met someone. I always am like, I need to meet someone first.
Yeah.
But regardless, I'm not supporting Andrew Yang because of what his personality may be. I'm supporting Andrew Yang because he supports universal basic income. I'm supporting Andrew Yang because he wants to make life more affordable for folks in New York. He wants to be able to increase the affordable housing. He wants to be able to make our economy more focused on humanity in that community, right? Than just the individual, just those who are at the top of our economy. And that's what it's about for me. I think that when it comes to the conversations I've had with folks who are very opposed to me on cultural issues, very opposed to me on cultural or on even some political issues, there are three things every American or like most Americans kind of agree on. Government is not truly working to benefit the majority of the American people.
Yeah.
We have a media that is not focused on truly informing and giving solid facts about what's happening in the
That one
world.
too. Agree with that.
And three, we don't have a economy that's fair for the American people, and we have one that is like Wall Street and private corporations have more power than they should. For the right, they'll say tech companies, Facebook, Twitter have too much power. For the left, they'll say, Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase, Lehman Brothers, well, they're gone now, but Goldman Sachs, those people have too much power. We have to be able to come together to understand, well, all these people are really working together in the same goals. And if we want to actually get something done, then we have to work together on the other end to be able to, unify on the basis of what we can unify by, which is the economics for the most part, which is the government reform, the election reform for the most part. And then when it comes to the cultural issues, we can keep fighting on that front and we will, I think, keep winning. I think that the tide is just going to keep rolling in that direction in the sense of you get progress in that direction. I say winning as far as I think culture is pretty solid with the left. And when it comes to economics, I think that there are ways that the left and right can complete both their goals by coming together on ideas that are just focused on, improving the economy and our government for the middle class and low income Americans.
Yeah, I will say the three problem statements that you stated before, I am wholeheartedly in agreement. And I would say, even for the groups you called out specifically by name, I would say even the right wing, when I look at polling, has a large distrust of Wall Street, in addition to Silicon Valley, Hollywood, various other industries. And so I agree that economics largely is going to be the way to unify. But I feel like very often we are being pitted against each other from these cultural issues. And for a lot of people, that does matter. Like, how do I talk? Obviously, you're a member of the bi community, but how do you talk to other people who are like, well, they want to take away, this is obviously more in the past during like the Obama era, they were opposing me being able to get married to someone of the same sex. This is very important to my individual life. Some of these cultural matters matter more specifically to some of these individual communities who are disenfranchised. And so I feel very often when I get to talk to some of those guests and I say, hey, we should be focusing on economics, they basically are telling me I'm like oversimplifying and that I'm basically making their issues the back burner and that we're really just catering to the white working class essentially to try and win them over and ignoring all the racism and other issues in it. How do you talk to those people who do see the value in these cultural issues as a talking point to actually come to some form of unity with the other side, because it clearly seems like they want to just fight back and forth rather than finding consensus.
Yeah, I'll say, man, that is definitely a section of at the end of the day, I think all working class folks, middle class, low income folks are there's going to be people from every group, I think, that are going to be needed. Not every group, but but the majority of the the groups that are represented by the majority of the American people, or by large segments of the American people, they're going to all be needed, really, I think, to effectively have the type of change and transformation that would be necessary for a country that really works. I think that, in all honesty, man, I don't have the answer in the sense of how I've been able to, I guess, get those people more on my side when it comes to economics being a highlight, and not to say that their issue is not a highlight as well. But for the most part, I think it just takes pointing to examples where they may feel they've gotten a victory on that cultural side, but then economically or in every other way, we have, not done well. And an example of this, I think, would be like, I'm trying to really, so I know that there was a big deal when there was the first female to be, I think, a CIA director or involved in the CIA.
They had some advertisement featuring. Yeah, I remember what you're talking about. Yep.
So that's great, right? And polling shows, by the way, that Latinx is a term that Latin Americans actually don't like. The majority of them don't think that that's something that they identify as and would prefer Latino or Latina. But when it comes to like examples like that, where the CIA is promoting how diverse they are, but they aren't telling you that they're also continuing to use every power given to them in the Patriot Act to spy on Americans, and to them and the NSA to spy on Americans and to look into all we're doing, and to if you're someone, I think, that's in a marginalized community like the LGBT community, you should be more concerned about the idea of government interference into your life, or surveillance into your life, than whether or not the individual who is leading the surveillance is in your your group or not. I don't know if you're going to be that excited either way, no matter what the identity of that individual is, right? And so I think it comes down to, let's just not let those identities or those cultural issues that we have be things that overcome the policy, overcome the actual, another example is I'll give this one, and I would say when it comes to the LGBT community, there has been still not much progress made on the availability of AIDS drugs and the affordability of AIDS drugs. I wouldn't say availability, but the affordability of AIDS drugs. So you mean to tell me we've had these 40 years of great technology, great success, great advancements in that field, and yet it's still hard and we still have people dying because they can't get to that? That's where, all right, well, universal health care is something that should be very important to the LGBT community, because there are people who are dying of AIDS right now that probably could be prevented if they had universal health care.
Yeah.
That's the type of ways I think we connected.
I think that does make a lot of sense. I mean, to me, this is getting at generally that you're not ignoring these issues by embracing a cultural aspect like universalism. We are saying that if there's a disparity, we are trying to eliminate that disparity so that it is, again, universal. I think about this very often as a way we can kind of culturally connect people, because very often we feel like it's this them versus us. If I'm talking specifically to your community's issues and, putting you up as a higher priority because we want to celebrate these types of leaders, we are often obviously going to create outgroups from that process. We've created some in-groups that we're focusing on, and therefore, if I'm not being talked about my community's issues, I'm the outgroup. And so I don't have problems necessarily with identity politics. This has been a learning process. There are issues within each group, like we've been talking about Asian hate crimes. We've talked here today about some of the issues facing the LGBTQ community. These issues are valid, but when it comes to things like tokenism, I think that's when we run into the problem, where it's that inherently who we are on the outside, or even inherently how we feel on the inside and who we are, doesn't necessarily mean we believe in the policies that will help everyone. And obviously, this is a very partisan way, but I could point to Black Republicans. I could point to gay Republicans. I could point to all these different forms that don't believe in helping establish these basics for people. And, their identity might be a nice tie-breaking factor, but I think that first priority, just like you said, does need to be those inherent systematic issues economically and government. I do think that's a great point.
I want to add, I would say one thing is that there's going to be a reality check at some point or another anyways, if we continue to go hard in that cultural kind of focus and not including some of the broader issues or the actual substantive policy solutions to some of those issues facing the various groups in our nation. Because an example would be the fact that Donald Trump did better with Black or African-American males, I believe, in particular, and Hispanics. Than any other president.
Past Republicans.
Yeah, I was going to say any other president that's or Republican candidate. So that should be kind of a ringing of the bell, of the alarm bell, to say, well, hey, folks, it isn't working, obviously, because they're going towards like the groups that they want to target the most, right? Or two of the groups they want to target the most, which was African Americans and Hispanic people, ended up voting more for the person that is the complete opposite of what they claim to be the cultural.
To just caveat that, they still overwhelmingly did vote for the Democrat. It was just far less than comparative years. Like I think it was something like it was 80% of Black men voted for Democrats, but in past years that was closer to around 88%. And so, you're right. And likewise, we also saw a shoot up of white men supporting the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
But continue on the point that you were making.
Well, and that's just interesting too, where it's like, in the kind of, a lot of progressive spaces, right? White men, right? Straight white men are supposedly, the all of them are inherently kind of a bad person, right? That's what a lot of, I don't know the details really on that belief system, but because I don't subscribe to it at all, but I do I do kind of get what they are saying in the sense of that's not necessarily correct, but it just shows how the group that they claim to be most responsible for the current problems in our society and that they want to kind of put a lot of cultural pressure on ends up being the group that actually votes most for them, and then the groups that you want to try to build in that coalition.
I just want to caveat those words again, because I think it's important. Because again, most white men still did vote for Trump. It's just that there was a change in the percentages. They moved more towards Biden than past years. But you're right in that I do think we have to be asking ourselves, is this style of politics attracting who we are even wanting to target? Do these forms of tokenization even attract those communities we're tokenizing? And I think that is definitely important to consider. And I will say, as a straight white man myself, we do feel that. That's certainly a pressure that comes from progressive spaces. And I get it. But I feel very often we're allowing ourselves to be just biased and bigoted rather than seeing people as individuals and hearing them out. We want to judge them first on the outward appearance. I just want to hear people. And that's why I love to be able to have conversations where we can actually really flesh out what we believe and hear what we think needs to be done. Because, we didn't talk about all the issues under the sun, but I'm sure if we talked long enough, we could find differences, you and I. So far, we've found a lot of similarities today. But I think that's really what are people focused on. And I think too often we're kind of making these judgments off of like broad, anonymous faces online. We're like, okay, I don't ever have to interact with that person, so I'm just going to wide swath the group and just be a little bit more hostile and negative than I otherwise would be in normal life. But Calvin, I want to thank you for coming on today to have these conversations, because I think they are very important to really hear the top, concerns of our community. So I want to thank you for that. And I want to also offer the opportunity, like I do with every guest on the Commoners Corner. Do you have any questions for me to wrap up today's episode, or any final thoughts that you want to share with the audience?
Absolutely. Well, I'll say this. As far as final thoughts, I have one question for you. As far as final thoughts, when it comes to, I think you go back to your question about how we maybe try and fix some of the issues facing us economically, how we try to unite the country, the working class, the middle class, and low income folks of this country together on the policies that are going to be needed to improve and transform this country for us. Those conversations, these type of conversations, are the type of things that are also important in that. And I think with that, social media and all that has definitely divided us to, or adds to that division in a way that is like we used to be able to sit down and have civil conversations about politics. That's rare now, it seems, right? And like we need more of that. But when it comes to my questions, I would say when it comes to New York, being in an area that is fairly blue, solid all the time, my question becomes to you: how do you get voter bases that are typically with more moderate Democrats to support programs that are more universal and that are more on the left?
I think that's a really good question. So I have a couple of ideas to that. One is just a style of politics. This is less of a policy reason and more of a just how do you actually campaign. And I think very often a lot of the left starts with this just straight hostile attitude where it's like we have to point out all the sins of this person. And I feel like that's very tough for a lot of people to accept, because if this person's the incumbent, that means people backed this person at one point. And if you're saying that over and over, they've backed this person, they've been an incumbent for a while, and you're just saying this person's like the absolute evil, truly incompetent moron, you're now calling all the people who voted for this person likewise that for their judgment. And I think that is a very off-putting starting point. I think we need to be doing more of a politics of kind of yes and, where we are starting to say like, yeah, we are accomplishing some things, but we're not doing enough. We could be doing this, or we're not doing this the right way. And I think that's the first thing, is just it's a way of approaching a tone. It's calling out, yes, that there are shortcomings, but that our opponents aren't always evil, essentially. That's one. The second thing is you actually have to know where we're struggling with voters. When it comes to moderate Democrats, who are they more often? They're older voters. And so that requires a couple things. It comes with talking specifically to issues that they're facing, whether that be in healthcare, whether that be in housing and trying to actually retire in the area that they grew up and had a home in, whether that just be safety in the streets. A lot of our elderly are the people who are being abused. I think those things are important, but it also requires actually going to where these people are. Like a lot of progressive organizing happens kind of within the activist crowds, on the street, and online. And we're not going to a lot of the hubs where older people are and actually like taking the time to talk to them. We're not as often actually going to Democratic Party meetings and all the people in the party. We're trying to run these constant through the outside campaigns rather than going a little bit more inside and actually meeting these people where they are. And then I guess the last thing is like, there is definitely a gravitation among the left. And you can believe these beliefs that you're entitled to. We talk about these all the time. But for socialism, just as a branding, you could talk about the actual implications of the policy or not. But as a branding terminology, that is very off-putting for a lot of older people. And you could talk all day about, oh, they've been propagandized and whatever. But guess what? They've been propagandized, so they believe these things then. And I will say it's more than just propaganda. There is legitimate debate to be had on it. But you have to recognize that these moderate Democrats are usually older, and that there is a generational divide of how are these terminologies, actually viewed. And so I think that's a lot of it. It's not as much. I mean, sometimes it's also like pick your battles, like choose the popular policy and focus on that. You don't run like necessarily a campaign purely off of, let's say, defund the police. That's like a policy that only right now has like 20% support. Pick something that's your more popular stuff and focus on that. And I guess that's what I'm going to go with. I could go all day on this. I should probably make a separate episode just on that one topic. But I hope I answered your question, Calvin.
I'll say this, man. You are interesting enough, very similar, I think, to the mindset that someone like me here in the South has to have when it comes to having conversations with more conservative voters and trying to get them more on the side of ideas that could be beneficial to, all sides, no matter where you are. And one of the biggest ways to do that is like when it comes to prioritizing issues. Of course, I may not be able to lead with universal health care here, right? But I could lead with campaign finance reform. That's an agreement that most people, even here in the South, agree on. We need to change the way money and politics work. So, I'm glad to hear that there's a similar approach that I think can be done, or not a similar approach, but there's a format for an approach that I think can be done, or a template. It just has to be altered maybe for each individual group that you want to try to get on your side.
Exactly. I mean, that is exactly the approach. And I will always emphasize, this is a quote from Tip O'Neill, all politics is local. Obviously, what I'm saying here comes from my own perspective as a New Yorker. And obviously, I'm trying to observe the national scene. But most of the time, go talk to the people in your area and trust your lived experience. You'll know what's the most pressing issues for your place. But Calvin, I want to thank you so much for coming and joining us on the People's Basics today. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to our audience.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Okay, so everyone, that was Calvin Cullen. We are very appreciative of coming on to the program. We would love for you, please, leave us your comments down below to what Calvin's question is. How do you think we can win over more moderate Democrats to embrace some of our more left-leaning economic agenda? We'd love to hear your thoughts. As well, check the description section down below to hit that Linktree link to find all of our links to join the community and sign up for an episode. As well, hit that subscribe button so that you're constantly notified when we have a new video upcoming for our movement on the universal basics of income, services, and rights. So that being said, to the universal people out there, thank you so much for watching. And as always, I hope you stay classy out there.